Welcome to SUGi Talks. At SUGi, we plant biodiverse pocket forests in urban areas and restore at-risk ecosystems around the world. Our mission is to help cities build climate resilience, biodiversity, and well-being using nature-based solutions. On this podcast, we'll speak with our expert forest makers, scientists, and collaborators about reimagining the urban experience and how we can better use nature to build healthier habitats for all life. Make sure you like and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts to support more. So in this episode of SUGi Talks, we'll meet Dr. Gray Coupland. Gray is our lead scientist at SUGi, and she holds the key to the rich data behind our pocket forests. Based in Perth, Australia, her STEM outreach program, which brings Miyawaki Forests into schools, was recognised by UNESCO's Green Citizens campaign. So she's a pretty big deal. With a PhD in ecology, her most recent work is dedicated to investigating the use and effectiveness of Miyawaki Forests in urban greening. Gray also built our first SUGi Pocket forest in Australia at South Padbury Primary School. And from within this forest, she's been gathering a lot of really important data about Miyawaki forests and their impact. So we'll be speaking about all that data and why these forests will be so important for our cities in the future. Hi, how are things? How are you? Thanks so much for coming on.
Oh, no worries. Yeah, just racing back from Murdoch, which is where I work. But I made it in time.
You did. No, we really appreciate you taking the time because I know you've got a very, very busy planting season ahead of you. So thank you.
No worries.
So we've been really keen to talk to you about the data that you've been collecting about the Miyawaki forests. So if it's okay, we'll get stuck into the questions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, go for it.
So what's your background and how did you start off working with the Miyawaki method?
Okay. So my background is actually quite diverse. I'm actually a marine ecologist. So I started off actually studying seagrass. I looked at the response of a particular species to burial and then did a lot of mass transplanting of seagrass as well, because we have an area off the coast of southwestern Australia, which is where I live, where we have a lot of seagrass loss due to mining activities. And one of my jobs was to help replant that area to repopulate the seagrass there. So that's where I started. And then I moved on to mangroves. And then after that, I did some work on nearshore communities, looking at the use of marine debris in the form of algae and all that wrack that washes up on the beaches and how that's used by animals and other organisms in the arid terrestrial zone. And then I did some plant biosecurity, and then I ended up on land fully looking at Miyawaki forests. And it's a bit of an embarrassing story about how I found out about the Miyawaki method.
Go on.
So I was trolling through Facebook, which I don't do anymore, I hasten to add. And one of the amazing shorts by World Economic Forum popped up on my feed. And I thought, what's this? This looks really interesting. And it was all about Miyawaki forests and how they can help to regreen our cities. And I was like, wow, this is so amazing. And then I delved into it and did some, research and to find out a bit more about the method. And I thought, this is fantastic. I totally want to do this. And it went from there.
So by then, greening cities had become really important to you. What was the shift that happened?
Oh, extremely. Yeah. So I actually took some time off after when I got pregnant with my first son. And during that time, I had a lot of time to reflect. And then I had another son. And then after that, I went back to work. But I think my attitude towards going back to work had changed quite considerably with the fact that I had children. And I realized how important having livable cities, is for human health and well-being. And part of that was looking at urban greening and ways to make our cities more livable by introducing nature back into our cities. So that kind of led me on to, wow, these are really amazing forests. For the Miyawaki forests, a really tiny ecosystem within our city that can bring so much biodiversity back into our cities and has all the benefits associated with it, like cooling and health and well-being benefits for people being able to visit these forests and to engage in some Shinrin-yoku forest bathing. So yeah, these forests are just win-win. win and more win.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And it's what we're all about at SUGi. And I know this is a huge part of your own work too. And we'll get into the major benefits shortly. But first, why do you think nature is so overlooked within the design of cities? It sometimes feels quite trivialized, as if it doesn't matter.
It's often it's the last thing that people add on to building design and building, cityscapes. And it's the first thing to be dropped off when finances get, tight. And it's basically the first thing that we should be putting on, and the last thing we should absolutely remove from any planning document. It's the greening elements, so critical.
And for those people who might not be familiar with the Miyawaki method, what's it all about and what's the science behind it?
So the idea obviously all comes from the amazing Professor Akira Miyawaki. So back in the 1970s, he was really concerned about the loss of native forest across Japan, and he noticed that around the temples and shrines across Japan, there were these remnant patches of forest. And he thought his idea was, this is basically what should be there. And the idea of potential natural vegetation, what should be in an area, if it hadn't been cleared. And his idea behind the Miyawaki method was to help regenerate the soil to provide optimal conditions for plant growth and plant species that would have been there prior to the area being cleared. So these are species that are perfectly suited to the environment into which they're going to be placed. And of course, the idea of planting the plants densely with soil remediation encourages the rapid growth of these plants. So you can reach a climax community much faster than you could using more traditional methods of planting.
Yeah, I love how conscious it is and how it really takes every layer of the forest and considers it. So at SUGi, one of the major benefits that we like to shout about is the effect of Miyawaki forests and trees in general on cooling down cities. And I know you've done some research and work on this, and it's a major thing for you too. So how can these forests help us?
Well, so to combat the urban heat sink, Miyawaki forest and any form of urban greening can be extremely beneficial in our cities. So as part of the research that I conduct, I actually looked at the heat benefits associated with planting a forest to the reduction in heat. So I took some temperature recordings on a 34-degree day here. So this is a typical summer day in Perth. The surface temperature was really ranged considerably across the area where I was taking the measurements. So the first measurements I took were on a grassed area, which is just outside the staff room in one of the school forest areas. And that was 36 degrees. And then I walked from the car park from the grass area to the car park, and the surface of the car park was 58 degrees.
Ooh.
And then I walked over to the forest and it was 26.
Wow.
I rest my case. Yeah, pretty impressive. Yeah, it's insane. And in actual fact, what was really interesting was there was a sandy slope that is just next to the forest that doesn't have any vegetation on it at that point in time anyway. And that was 50 degrees. So it was almost as hot as the car park. So it just shows the enormous heat that can come off bare sand. So even if you have bare sand, it doesn't mean you're safe from heat. You should be putting some plants on it.
God, it's incredible. I was just on holidays recently in a city, and I found myself scrambling to find a street with trees on it just to cool down. It was really, really intense, and it's just going to get worse, really.
Yeah. Oh, it's awful. It's really awful. And even the sides of buildings, they can radiate the heat back as well. So it's not just the ground that we're walking on, it's the buildings around us as well. And you know that the terrible heat they're having in Tokyo at the moment. Have you heard about the heat wave through Tokyo? And the heat there has been appalling, and they've had people collapsing in the street, just from the sheer, heat exhaustion. Yeah, it's very troubling. So our cities really are in crisis. We really, really do need to do something about the urban heat sink effect. So,
yeah. And this forest that you measured, this was a relatively young forest. It was the SUGi Pocket forest in Perth, yeah?
That forest is the one at South Padbury. So this is the SUGi forest that I've got with SUGi. So that forest was only 7 months old, and the ground temperature was already 26 degrees compared to 36 for the grass. That's a 7-month-old forest. Imagine,
Wow.
If I did that again, what that would be like. Yeah.
It's pretty incredible. So trees and urban forests, they're fundamental to cooling our cities down.
Oh, trees, exactly. And I might want to stress here that grass is great. You can put grass down, you can have big grassy parks. But, from the evidence that I've collected myself, on a 34-degree day, grass can be 36 degrees. You need the shade that's provided by, trees to actually do, more effective cooling. So grassed areas are great, but you need trees as well.
So we need to act fast. We should be populating cities with these trees, with these forests, like now, because they take time to grow.
Unless it's a Miyawaki forest.
Of course. We need Miyawaki forests. That's why we need Miyawaki forests.
That's right. Roll on the Miyawaki forest.
No, I think I just proved our point more precisely. So what are some of the other benefits of Miyawaki forests in cities particularly?
Having a Miyawaki forest in a city, some of the services it can provide, it can be in terms of prevention of water runoff and flood management, because we've seen the real benefits provided by having a dense forest structure. And this was evident in Japan when they have the tsunami event that came through. Areas that were protected by a peripheral patch of forest saw significantly less damage to buildings on the other side of the forest compared to areas that were just open to the sea. So huge benefits for having forests in particular areas for flood management. Of course, they provide healthy soils, and the benefits to humans are in terms of physical and mental well-being. We know that green spaces in our cities are essential for health and well-being. They encourage people to go out and exercise, which is important for physical health, but in terms of mental health, the benefits are enormous as well, because we know that if people live within 1 kilometre of a substantial green space, that they're less prone to depression and feelings of loneliness. So that's a really critical thing for humans living in cities: access to a substantial green space, and all that can provide. And of course, the knowledge and benefits from having somewhere beautiful to go and visit. You can share, particularly in areas where you have a strong Indigenous presence, like in the southwest of Western Australia. If you have patches of biodiverse areas and all the amazing organisms that can inhabit them, there's ability to pass on traditional knowledge to modern people living in cities who may not have access to nature normally, and they can pass on some of their traditional knowledge, which is so valuable for modern society. So yeah.
Well, those studies are really important, the ones you mentioned, and quite relevant to today, as we've seen there's a loneliness epidemic that's sweeping through a lot of Western cities. I guess this comes back around to the work that we've been doing with you, which is gathering the data behind these Miyawaki forests. And this data is especially important for us to really hammer home the message of just how useful they can be and how effective they can be. So we've been developing a protocol. So can you tell us how you've been going about that and what exactly you've been measuring too?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, definitely. Data collection is essential. We need more. The more data we have, the more we can spread the word, and people can, believe what they're seeing. So every Miyawaki forest that we plant in SUGi is, I know each forest maker has their own rationale behind why they're planting, but we often all agree that we're trying to enhance local biodiversity, restore the landscape, and also to engage the community in environmental action. And the aim is to monitor our forests so that we can gather data on the benefits associated with Miyawaki forests and use this to inform urban restoration programs and greening programs, policy making, and to provide this information to national and international forums. So the data we gather, primarily at the moment, it's looking at the height of the plants, so we can get a gauge of how quickly these forests are growing, the survival rate of our forests. So often you find in traditional methods of reforestation, you can actually have very low survival rates. It can be as low as 5%, and typically it sits around 50 or 60% or even lower. What you find with the Miyawaki method is often the survival rates are really high, around 80% plus, and sometimes over 90% plus. And I think part of the reason why the Miyawaki method has such a high survival rate is that people really love their forests. Okay, they take care of them. And because of this, they have a period where you do need to maintain the forest for 2 years or 3 years, but after that it becomes a self-sustaining ecosystem. And once you've done that, you can walk away, and in the knowledge that you've created a beautiful biodiverse habitat. And along the process of doing that, we're monitoring this to see how rapidly these forests can grow, to show the benefits of this method, and they can bring biodiversity back quickly, and can build an ecosystem quickly, which is what we really need at the moment.
I love this. I know this is a big part of your own work, and it's fundamental to what we do at SUGi too. The approach of making Miyawaki forest building a communal activity within a community. It really tackles this idea of separation from us and nature, and that sense of alienation that often comes with urban life and living in general in the digital age. Giving people that opportunity to reconnect, to nurture life, and watch a forest grow and be part of that process. It's a really powerful thing.
Exactly. Yeah. That's what I've been finding. Because I work primarily with children. I bring these pocket forests into the school community, and some of the children that I work with have never planted a plant before, and they've never played in the dirt before. And so planting the forest, planting their very own forest, is the first foray into any of this sort of activities. And by the end of planting day, the look of excitement on these children's faces that they've actually helped to plant a forest is quite inspirational. But what really excites me is when the children come back with me to monitor their forest every month. They first start with looking for their particular plant that they've planted in their forest and see how well that's going. But after a few months of monitoring, they're no longer just looking at their own plant. They're looking at the whole forest and going, oh, wow, look how much it's grown, what animals we're going to find today, really engaged in the whole forest. And there's such a strong sense of ownership with that forest. That's my forest, is what I often get. And this is our forest. This is what we have done. And, they love their forest. And I think the really exciting thing about the Miyawaki method is that it does engage the community in environmental action, because it has such tangible outcomes. Often, we don't have much access to nature in our cities. The thing is, engaging with children and nature is critical, because it's only if you care for something that you're going to fight for it. And we need this generation to be the advocates for nature, the eco warriors and scientists of the future. And for that, they really need to feel an affinity for it. So that's really critical.
And I guess this is a good opportunity to bring up the fact that your STEM outreach program has been recognised by UNESCO's Green Citizens campaign. So that's pretty big.
Yeah, it was. That was quite exciting. Yeah. So they approached me and said, would you like to be part of the UNESCO Green Citizens campaign? I said, oh, yes, absolutely. Yeah. So I'm one of 100 UNESCO Green Citizens programs for the 2021-22. So that's very exciting, and it's only one of 2 UNESCO Green Citizens programs in Australia. So yeah, that was very exciting, and very happy to get that.
Absolutely, it's great, it's brilliant, and your work is so important down there. So I know we've touched on this briefly, but I think it's really important. There are traditional methods of reforestation, tree planting, incentives, and all that, but then there's the Miyawaki methods. And how have you compared them? And I think it's important that we kind of talk about the differences and how we've been measuring that, or how you've been measuring that.
When I plant my forest here, I plant as part of a research program. So I have an outreach side, which I take the forest into schools, and I also plant, I study the forest that I plant from a research perspective. And as part of that process, I plant the forest according to the Miyawaki method, but then I plant around the peripheral areas and, more broadly around the forest using traditional methods. So there's no soil remediation. The plants are spaced according to traditional methods, which is typically, about 1.5 meters apart. It's a wide spacing. And I've noticed a rather huge difference in terms of the plant growth and the basal diameter of the plants inside the forest compared to outside. So inside the forest, the plants are often, some of the species are twice as large as, or even more than the plants outside the forest. And the basal diameter, which is the thickness of the stem, it can often be 5 times that of the plants outside the forest. So the idea behind this, you can see how effective the Miyawaki method is, compared to the normal method of planting. And the benefits of this is that you can create habitat quickly. And given, the state that our cities are in, rapid habitat creation is really essential for helping to make our cities more livable and combat, the urban heat sink. So definitely benefits to the Miyawaki method. So, and there's also benefits in terms of the soil as well. So I've noticed the microbial community within the forest is much more complex and more abundant compared to outside in the unvegetated areas. So that's very interesting as well.
And what about single tree planting, which is quite common in cities?
Yeah, well, in the area where I live, single tree planting along verges is a very common practice, and this is the same for many, cities around the world. And the problem with this is because, particularly in my city, Perth, Western Australia, the trees are planted, maybe 5-10 meters apart. Often they're not native species, so they're not adapted to the climate in which they're being planted. And because of that, they don't necessarily provide a good habitat for native organisms to go and inhabit. And because it's a single species, you don't have any structural diversity. It's just, there's no canopy layer in association with an understory layer. And, the understory layer is really critical for providing habitat for a diverse array of organisms and pollinators. So by just planting, one tree every 5 to 10 meters, we're just not providing the support that biodiversity in our cities needs. And if you're really conscious about trying to bring biodiversity back into our cities and making a more sustainable environment, you really do need to plant the biodiversity, to bring the biodiversity in. So it's two-way.
So we spoke about the power of Miyawaki Forests in building biodiversity. I think we don't often relate a passing bee to our food chain or think about how the microbes in our soil are a critical part of maintaining balance in our own ecosystem. Can you talk a little bit about why biodiversity is so important on a fundamental level?
Okay, so biodiversity is basically the huge array of different organisms that we have across our planet. So yeah, it's critical. It underpins the natural world. If we lose biodiversity, we lose a whole bunch of benefits that are associated with it. So you lose ecosystem stability. It's obviously there's the terrible consequence of acceleration of extinction, increased disease transmission to humans, because biodiversity is essential for health and well-being, and obviously it's a threat to food security and medicinal resources that can be provided. So biodiversity is really critical to the whole balance of our natural world. So in terms of the services that can be provided, there's obviously, if you have a biodiverse community, you have such as provided by a Miyawaki forest. So Miyawaki forest within a city, even if you have 100-meter squared forest, you're providing habitat for a variety of organisms. And if you have enough of these biodiverse patches across your city, you can actually link remnant patches of vegetation that are around the peripheral areas of the city. So you can create stepping stones across the urban landscape. Of course, if you have a biodiverse habitat, you're providing a food source for pollinator species, which are extremely critical for food production, and that can be for urban food production as well. So you're providing a resource for them. There was a study conducted in Melbourne just recently where they actually used part of the roadway to actually fill it with a biodiverse understory species, lots of different shrubs that had lots of beautiful flowers, and they saw a significant increase in the diversity of organisms coming in to use that. And they had an increase in number of species of butterfly and birds coming in and all sorts of different things. So, and that, of course, will have a flow-on effect to the community at large. Even being able to see, these beautiful patches of vegetation and all the animals that are coming in to use them, I think would have an enormous impact on the health and well-being. And we know there's so many studies out there now that have shown, how beneficial green space is to humans. So we really need to be, more active in this front.
You mentioned this earlier, but what exactly is the biodiversity crisis?
This is really depressing. So basically it's the decline or disappearance of biological diversity across our planet. So that can be a decline in the number, the genetic variability and the variety of species, and also in the number of biological communities. So and that is also inextricably linked to the climate crisis. So the two go hand in hand. So with the widespread destruction of habitat, and all the associated effects of climate change, which is seeing, the warming of particular areas in oceans, and so all that is impacting on the biodiversity crisis and causing, the decline in species numbers and genetic variability. And of course, this will ultimately affect humans. No matter how, if humans we often see ourselves as separate from nature, but we are actually part of nature. And I think part of the problem of helping to try and solve the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis is the fact that humans, we need to recognize that we are not separate from nature. We are actually part of it. And the only way to tackle the problems is to see ourselves as part of, nature and all that.
And has there been any case studies that really impressed you or showed you just how powerful these Miyawaki forests can be in that sense?
Brett is one of the forest makers with SUGi. So in terms of particular benefits of our biodiverse states, not necessarily with the community, but with the local environment, he's been planting amazing pocket forests up in far north Queensland. And he's primarily planting these to provide habitat for endangered species like the cassowary and the sugar glider population there. And he's actually, I think one of his forests is only 3 years old, and he's already seen cassowary with a chick walking through one of his forests. And if that is not a good example of how impactful, biodiverse planting can be, I don't know what is. Yeah, I was quite blown away when he showed me that picture. It was awesome.
So I love asking our forest makers, ecologists and scientists this question because it's a hopeful vision of the future. So in an ideal world, if there was no limits, what would a healthy city look like to you? If you could integrate nature in whatever way you wanted, and the best way you could, what would a city look like?
Oh gosh, the dream city, hey? I would like to see cars, the severe reduction in the number of cars in cities. So in Australia in particular, we have a really high, heavy car dependency. The cities are built for cars with roads instead of being built for people. So if we can reduce the amount of roads and provide sort of light rail systems. So I'm just going to go on now because this is my passion. Light rail systems where we have easy to access public transport where people can hop on, hop off where they need to. You have communities built around a green space that you have to walk into rather than drive your car in, because the very fact that we all rely on our cars and we drive everywhere and we drive into our driveway and we park in our garage, there's no interaction with neighbors anymore. We've lost that. And back before we had such a heavy dependence on cars, people were walking, people were riding their bikes. This is probably a problem that's maybe more common in Australia, where we have very large sprawling cities than it would be for somewhere like London, where everything's more densely packed and there is a more greater reliance on public transport for people to get around. But for big sprawling cities, it leads the car reliance leads to people being separated from each other and not engaging with their local community as much. So for me, it's removing cars a little bit out of the equation and making more green space across our cities. Because if we have more green space and more make our cities built around people walking and riding, then naturally the community flows from that. And then, we can actually have planting along our verges and along where streets used to be. We can have beautiful forested areas with understories that are bursting with life, pollinator highways and all the beautiful things that will make cities such a lovely place to live.
Absolutely. And how possible is that?
Local councils often have access to all the strips of, the curb areas of, we have huge curb areas in Perth and in many cities around the world. They have these big areas. And if we can plant them, even with low-lying vegetation, just understory species, we could have pollinator highways running along our streets, and it would be so beautiful, so lovely to walk along those streets to see all that nature right, where you're walking and in your suburb. I think people would feel the benefit once they actually start seeing it in place.
Yeah, totally. And, even just the aesthetics of it, it would be so stunning and so healthy. So that would be beautiful.
A utopia.
Absolutely.
A utopia.
But how do you feel? Do you think there's any movement towards that in a sense?
I think there is definitely movement there is definitely movement, because we see beautiful examples in Curitiba. They have the mayor there was so forward thinking. He actually was one of the amazing person who said, right, let's close off this street to cars, the main part of the city that, the thoroughfare that went through the city. He said, let's close off this main street. And he closed it off and he made it just for pedestrians. And then this was an area of the city that was struggling. The businesses were struggling and there was very little foot traffic. And suddenly the businesses were booming. The foot traffic was there. The people started to engage in this community, and then he started to spread this out. And then I think it's got huge, one of the most, per size of the city, it's got one of the largest green areas, green space in the cities anywhere. And then the idea was that, he would pay people to help clean up the rubbish. So he paid people to go and collect tires and bring them into a tire recycling place. And then they had a huge drop in the amount of mosquito-borne diseases as a result of that. And then, of course, this flowed on to the health and well-being of the people. So yeah, if you have visionary leaders who are prepared to take, act and take measures that are perhaps, a bit uncomfortable at first, then we can actually start to make progress. But if people are conservative and they feel, they need to stay with the status quo, then we aren't going to have the change we need. But I know there are people out there. I know there's change that's brewing. So, and it's happening. So, yeah, it's just, we need to speed it up.
Absolutely. And I think your work is a major part of pushing this forward. So we're coming to our end. And this is another question we like to ask everyone, because the way people approach it is so wildly different. And especially for you guys who are at the forefront of this, who are so involved with nature. So what is one thing nature has taught you?
Oh, one thing? That's too hard. Oh gosh. Okay, I guess the most important thing that nature has taught me is to sit quietly and listen. I think because nature has the answers we're looking for. So I think, if we just sit quietly and listen to nature, we can learn so much. That's the important thing.
So thank you so much, Gray. Really appreciate you taking the time.
No, my pleasure.
If you like this episode of SUGi Talks, make sure you like and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts to support more.